The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days, but that wasn't why Marcus Webb's hands were shaking as he stood outside the door of apartment 4B, holding a manila envelope that could either save his life or end it completely. He had rehearsed this moment for 11 years, every word, every apology, every version of how she might react when she opened that door and saw the man who had destroyed her family standing on her welcome mat. He raised his fist to knock, and before his knuckles even touched the wood, the door swung open, and there she was, this stranger who was not a stranger at all, looking at him with an expression that stole every rehearsed word from his throat. "Don't look so surprised," she said, and smiled in a way that made his knees nearly buckle. "You already knew exactly who I was." Marcus stood frozen on the threshold, rain dripping from his coat onto the hallway carpet, staring at a woman he had never met but somehow recognized in the deepest part of his chest, the way you recognize a nightmare you've had 100 times. Her eyes were the same shade of amber brown as the little girl's had been in the photograph he still carried in his wallet, the photograph from the courtroom exhibit that the prosecutor had held up while describing the family Marcus Webb's delivery truck had shattered on a rain-slicked highway in the winter of 2015. He had spent 11 years in Danbury Correctional believing that if he ever crossed paths with anyone from that family again, they would spit in his face, and he would deserve it. Instead, this woman, who could only be the daughter who survived, was standing in her doorway with a strange, sad smile, inviting the man who killed her mother and little brother into her home. If this story about redemption and unexpected grace is already tugging at something in you, that's exactly why this channel exists, stories about kindness finding its way into the darkest corners of people's lives, about second chances nobody thought they deserved. If you believe people can change, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me what second chances means to you, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Her name was Elena Reyes, and she had been 19 years old when the truck driven by a 26-year-old named Marcus Webb, for hours into an illegal double shift his trucking company had pressured him into working, crossed the median and ended her mother's life and her 7-year-old brother's life in the space of 4 seconds. Elena had been the one who survived, thrown clear of the wreckage with a broken pelvis and a memory that replayed the sound of crumpling metal every night for years afterward. Marcus had survived too, though some nights in prison he wished he hadn't, and he had used those 11 years the only way he knew how to make himself worth the air he was still breathing. He had gotten his GED, then an associate's degree in social work through a prison education program, and he had spent every possible hour counseling other incarcerated men about safe driving, about exhaustion, about the arithmetic of grief that follows one moment of corporate greed disguised as one man's mistake. None of it had ever felt like enough. None of it had ever been meant to reach Elena. He hadn't even known her name until 3 weeks ago, when a letter arrived at the halfway house where he now lived, written in careful, deliberate handwriting, asking him to come to this address on this specific Tuesday. He had almost thrown the letter away twice. His parole officer, a weary but decent man named Terrence, had told him bluntly that showing up uninvited to a victim's life could be its own kind of violence, that some doors close for good reason and a man's freedom shouldn't come at the cost of someone else's healing. But the letter hadn't asked him to stay away. It had asked him to come. And now here he was, standing in her doorway, and here she was, not screaming, not slamming the door, but stepping backward and gesturing for him to enter as though he were an old friend arriving for dinner rather than the architect of the worst day of her life. Inside, her apartment smelled like cinnamon and old books, and there were photographs on nearly every wall, a shrine of ordinary joy, her mother laughing at some birthday party, her brother missing his front teeth in a school photo, a family that had once been whole. Marcus felt his throat tighten as Elena gestured for him to sit, and she took the chair across from him with the calm, unhurried posture of someone who had been waiting a long time for this conversation and had nothing left to fear from it. She told him she had followed his case for years, not out of vengeance, though there had been plenty of that in the early days, but because grief, when it has nowhere to go, calcifies into something that needs a shape, and for a long time Marcus Webb's face had been the only shape her grief could take. She had read every parole hearing transcript. She had learned, almost against her will, about the program he ran for other inmates, about the letters he wrote to trucking safety advocacy groups from his cell, about the fact that he had never once, in 11 years, asked for early release or claimed the crash wasn't his fault, even though his company's illegal scheduling practices had been quietly, disgracefully swept under the rug by their lawyers. Marcus tried to speak, tried to offer the apology he had spent over a decade constructing sentence by sentence, but Elena raised a hand and asked him, gently, to just listen for a moment, because she had things she needed to say first, things she had said only to an empty apartment and a photograph of her mother until now. She told him that for the first 4 years after the crash, she had wanted him to suffer every single day of his sentence and then some, that she used to write his name on paper and burn it just to feel some illusion of control over a universe that had taken everything from her in 4 seconds of highway. She told him about the nightmares, about the way she couldn't get into a car for 2 years without her hands shaking, about how she dropped out of college twice because grief kept swallowing her whole every time she tried to build something resembling a future. And then, in her 5th year of anger, her therapist had asked her a question that cracked something open in her: what would it cost you to keep hating a man who is already destroying himself with guilt? What would you be protecting by holding on to this? Elena said she hadn't had an answer that day, but the question never left her. She began, slowly, cautiously, to read about restorative justice, about the growing body of research showing that many victims' families found more healing in facing the person who harmed them than in years of separation and silence. She wasn't naive about it, she told Marcus firmly, her eyes steady on his face. This wasn't a fairy tale where the villain becomes the hero and everyone hugs it out. Her mother was still dead. Her brother would still be 7 years old forever, frozen in a school photo, never getting to grow up and disappoint her by leaving dishes in the sink or breaking her heart with typical brotherly nonsense, and that unlived life was a wound that would never fully close. But somewhere in the last 3 years, as she watched from a careful distance the way Marcus used his sentence not to disappear into self-pity but to actively work toward preventing the exact kind of tragedy that had taken her family, something had shifted in her from hatred into a strange, complicated respect, and eventually into something that felt dangerously close to compassion. Marcus finally found his voice, and it broke twice before he managed to say that he thought about her mother and her brother every single day, that he had learned their names, their birthdays, the fact that her mother had been a nurse and her brother had wanted to be an astronaut, because forgetting them felt like a second crime he refused to commit. He told her that no amount of counseling other inmates or writing letters to safety boards would ever balance the scale, that he understood if she needed him to simply exist as a name on a page rather than a person in her home, but that he would carry the weight of what he'd done for the rest of his life regardless of what she decided today. Elena listened to all of it with tears sliding down her face that she made no effort to hide, and when he finished, she told him something that broke him open completely. She said she hadn't invited him here to forgive him, not exactly, because forgiveness felt too small and too simple a word for what she was trying to do. She had invited him here because she was starting a non-profit, funded partly by a settlement she'd received from the trucking company after finally suing them for their scheduling violations, an organization aimed at trucking safety reform and support for families affected by fatigue-related accidents, and she wanted, of all people, for Marcus to help her build it, because nobody understood the human cost of corporate negligence more intimately than the man who had unknowingly carried it out. The room went silent except for the rain against the window, and Marcus sat there feeling something he hadn't felt in 11 years, something dangerously close to hope, tangled up inextricably with a grief that would never fully leave him. He asked her why she would want the face of her worst nightmare working alongside her every day, and Elena said something he would remember for the rest of his life, that hatred had never once brought her mother back, that punishment alone had never stitched together the hole in her chest, but that watching a broken man spend a decade trying, however imperfectly, to turn his worst day into something that might protect other families, that had done more to heal her than any amount of anger ever could. She said forgiveness wasn't a gift she was giving him. It was a door she was opening for herself, because she refused to let one truck crash on one rainy highway define the rest of her life, and she refused to let hatred be the only inheritance her mother and brother left behind in her heart. Over the following months, Marcus began working with Elena's fledgling organization, first quietly, hesitantly, terrified of overstepping, and then with a growing, humbled sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before the crash. They spoke at trucking safety conferences together, an unlikely pair whose story made grown executives go quiet in ways that statistics never could. They visited high schools, warning young drivers about fatigue and corporate pressure. Marcus watched Elena slowly reclaim pieces of herself that grief had stolen. She started driving again, tentatively at first, and one afternoon she called him, laughing through tears, to tell him she had driven all the way to the coast and back without a single panic attack, that she had brought her mother's old cassette tapes and played them the whole way, singing along badly and joyfully. Marcus, for his part, found himself forgiving pieces of his own past he hadn't realized he was still punishing himself for, understanding for the first time that true accountability didn't require permanent self-destruction, that a man could hold his guilt like a compass rather than a chain. If any part of this story has touched something in you, if you believe that grief and grace can somehow occupy the same room, please take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear that redemption is possible even after the unthinkable. Your support means everything to this channel and helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Before we reach the end of Elena and Marcus's story, I want you to comment the word hope below if you believe, even a little, that people can change, and that forgiveness can be its own quiet form of courage. 2 years after that rainy Tuesday knock on her door, Elena stood at a podium at the opening of the Marcus Webb Family Safety Foundation, a small nonprofit that had, against every statistical odds, already helped pass new fatigue management legislation in 2 states. She looked out into the crowd and found Marcus near the back, the way he always positioned himself, still uncomfortable taking up too much space in a story that had once been entirely his fault. She invited him up to stand beside her, and as she spoke about her mother and brother, about the unbearable weight of loss and the surprising, fragile beauty of choosing connection over vengeance, she reached over and took his hand, not as forgiveness performed for an audience, but as 2 people who had built something meaningful out of the wreckage of an unthinkable day. Marcus Webb, who had once believed he would spend the rest of his life as nothing more than the villain in someone else's tragedy, stood there with tears streaming freely down his face, finally understanding that some doors, once opened with courage instead of fear, don't just let people back into your life. They let you back into your own.